What if war broke out between Iran and the United States? This question, while terrifying, has crossed the minds of political analysts, historians, and everyday citizens for decades. The two countries have had a deeply complicated relationship with moments of extreme tension and near confrontation. But what would actually happen if a full scale war erupted between Iran and the United States in the 21st century? In this video, we explore the political, military, economic, and human consequences of such a conflict, not as a prediction, but as a scenario analysis to better understand the stakes involved. To begin, it's essential to understand the background. The relationship between the US and Iran has been strained since 1979, when the Iranian Revolution overthrew the US-backed Shah and installed the Islamic Republic under Ayatollah Khomeini. The hostage crisis that followed, where 52 Americans were held for 444 days, set the tone for decades of hostility. Since then, both countries have often found themselves on opposite sides of Middle Eastern conflicts. Iran has supported groups like Hezbollah and various Shia militias, while the US has maintained a strong military presence in the region and formed alliances with countries like Israel and Saudi Arabia. The nuclear issue has been a central flashpoint. Iran insists its nuclear program is peaceful, but the United States and its allies have long suspected it seeks to build nuclear weapons. The 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or Iran Nuclear Deal, provided temporary relief, but the US withdrawal from the agreement in 2018 reignited tensions. In recent years, incidents like the killing of Iranian General Qasem Soleimani by a US drone strike and Iran's retaliatory missile attacks on US bases in Iraq brought both nations dangerously close to open war. Now, let's imagine a tipping point. Perhaps it starts with a high-profile attack blamed on Iran, or a miscalculation in the Persian Gulf. Perhaps US intelligence detects evidence of a nuclear breakout attempt by Iran. Regardless of the trigger, both sides decide that diplomacy has failed. The US launches a series of airstrikes on Iranian military targets, and Iran responds with missile attacks on American bases and ships in the region. Within days, war has begun. The first stage would likely be an intense air and naval campaign. The US military, with its massive global reach, would target Iran's command and control infrastructure, missile sites, air defenses, and nuclear facilities. The US Navy would attempt to assert dominance over the Strait of Hormuz, a strategic choke point through which nearly a fifth of the world's oil passes. Iran, in turn, would launch missiles and drones at US bases in Iraq, the UAE, Bahrain, and possibly Israel. It might also unleash its network of proxy forces in Iraq, Lebanon, Syria, and Yemen to open multiple fronts and stretch US capabilities. Iran's geography would complicate matters for any ground invasion. It's a mountainous, vast country, roughly the size of Alaska, with a population of over 85 million. The US would be unlikely to launch a full-scale ground invasion, but if it did, the costs would be enormous. Iran's military is no match for the US in terms of technology or resources, but it has significant asymmetrical capabilities, from ballistic missiles and anti-ship mines to cyber warfare and well-trained militias. The war wouldn't be quick or clean. It would be protracted, chaotic, and potentially spill into neighboring countries. Economically, the impact would be felt around the world almost immediately. Oil prices would skyrocket as the Persian Gulf becomes a war zone. Iran could target oil infrastructure in Saudi Arabia or the UAE, just as it was accused of doing in 2019 with attacks on Aramco facilities. Global markets would panic, supply chains would be disrupted, and inflation could spike across many economies already under pressure. Countries like China, India, and European nations, all of which rely on Gulf oil, would be deeply affected and likely call for an immediate ceasefire. Diplomatically, the war would divide the international community. NATO allies might support the US in principle but hesitate to join the fight. Russia and China would likely oppose US actions, possibly offering diplomatic or logistical support to Iran. The United Nations would be paralyzed by vetoes, and peace talks would be difficult to initiate until both sides suffered heavy costs. Iran might also use the war to unite its population under nationalist sentiment, even those who oppose the regime, while anti-war protests could erupt in the US and around the world. Casualties would be devastating. Iranian civilians would bear the brunt of airstrikes and infrastructure collapse. Hospitals could be overwhelmed, food and water supplies disrupted, and millions displaced. The US military would suffer losses from missile attacks, drone strikes, and guerrilla warfare. Regional allies like Israel and Saudi Arabia could be targeted, pulling them deeper into the conflict. In Iraq and Syria, American troops would face increased attacks from Iranian-backed militias. There is even the possibility of terrorism against US assets abroad or cyber attacks against critical infrastructure at home. The human cost in Iran would be severe. Its military and civilian infrastructure would be hit hard, and the economy would likely collapse entirely. Sanctions are already crippling. Full-scale war would be catastrophic. In the US, the political cost could be immense. The memory of Iraq and Afghanistan still lingers, and a new war in the Middle East could divide public opinion, trigger protests, and influence elections. If conscription were introduced, unlikely but possible in a worst-case scenario, it would dramatically alter the domestic landscape. Then there's the nuclear question. Iran does not currently have nuclear weapons, but a war could change that calculus. If Iran's leadership sees regime survival at risk, they may accelerate efforts to acquire a weapon or threaten to use chemical or biological alternatives. Conversely, Israel, which has a policy of nuclear ambiguity, might decide to act unilaterally if it believes Iran is close to a nuclear breakout. The possibility of a wider regional war or even a nuclear standoff becomes more real with every passing day of conflict. Cyber warfare would also be a major component. Iran has already demonstrated its cyber capabilities, including attacks on Saudi oil infrastructure and US banks. In a war scenario, Iranian hackers could target US power grids, water systems, or financial institutions. The US, with far superior cyber tools, could paralyze Iranian communication systems, disrupt propaganda outlets, and cripple infrastructure. But cyber attacks don't stop at borders. Spillover effects could impact allies, neutral countries, and even private companies. Eventually, pressure would mount for a ceasefire. The longer the war drags on, the greater the toll on all involved. Civilians on both sides, global markets, and diplomatic institutions would push for peace. A negotiated settlement might involve regime concessions in Iran, withdrawal of US forces, and international supervision of Iran's weapons programs. However, rebuilding trust would be nearly impossible. The Middle East would be further destabilized, and the scars of war, political, economic, and psychological, would last for generations. But perhaps the most important consequence of a US-Iran war is what it would mean for the global order. Such a conflict would signal the erosion of diplomacy in favor of force, the failure of international institutions to prevent war, and the increasing fragility of peace in a multipolar world. It could embolden other nations to settle disputes militarily or create new alliances aimed at countering American power. In the long term, it could accelerate the decline of US influence, increase instability across the Middle East, and push millions into poverty, displacement, or extremism. In the end, the question isn't just what happens if the US and Iran go to war, it's what happens to the world as a result. War between these two nations wouldn't be a regional event, It would be global in its impact, widespread in its consequences, and devastating for millions of innocent people. It's a scenario that all sides must work tirelessly to avoid. Diplomacy, dialogue, and patience may be slow and imperfect, but they are far better than the alternative. Thanks for watching. If you found this video thought-provoking, please like, share, and subscribe. What do you think would happen if the US and Iran went to war? Let us know in the comments, and stay tuned for more deep dives into the world's most pressing issues.